Good morning and welcome back to Stay in Your Lane. I'm your host, John Maley, brought to you by Triple T Transport. Got Dan North for you guys. Sit down, grab a pad, paper, make some notes. Dan's title is Senior Economist North America. Been with Allianz 24, 25 plus years now.
Yep, hard to believe.
Well, you don't look a day older than 29. So, since we last talked in September, we have had an election. Starting to see ripples, some pushback. We hear all kinds of things right now. Tell us what to believe. Tell us what you see, where we're headed. Get the crystal ball out. Fire it up, Dan.
All right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I do have three topics, and that's the first one I was going to talk about. And I am going to leave out altogether the politics side of it, the cabinet picks and all that stuff. But I'm going to talk about what the proposed economic policies are and the effects they might have. So, what we call the fiscal policy, the taxing and spending policy, is definitely pro growth. And so he's going to extend those 2017 tax cuts out. And the proposal is to cut the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. And those should provide some stimulation to the economy. And then, of course, there are the what he's been talking about deportation and slowing immigration. Well, if you have slower immigration, it's immigrants do contribute to the economy, and we're going to try and deport a lot of people. That could be a negative on the economy as well. Whatever your beliefs might be, it can be a drag. So it's pro growth. It's stimulative, except there's one problem, which is the tariffs, the proposed tariffs. So tariffs are usually a loser for both sides because you start a tariff war. Okay, we're going to impose tariffs of 25% on country A. Well, guess what? They're going to impose 25% tariffs on our goods, and it goes back and forth. So, for instance, in our country, let's say we put a 25% tariff on good country A. Those goods are now 25% more expensive, which directly hurts consumers. And when there's the tariff going the other way, the other country puts tariffs on our goods, there's less employment on our side. And it goes both ways, back and forth. Both things happen. So it's usually a loser economically. It's harder on consumers, and you probably will lose jobs because you're not exporting so much. So tariffs, as I say, can be usually are a loser, but they can be very effective in terms of negotiations. For instance, Trump came out just out of the blue and said, we're going to put 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico. We need to stop this flow of undocumented aliens and drugs from Canada and Mexico. Well, suddenly the Prime Minister of Canada and Mexico come come to the table and say, let's talk about things, because something like 20% of all of Canada's economic activity, of Canada's GDP, is exports to the U.S. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to put a 25% tariff on, a significant portion of your economy, that's a pretty important. That's a pretty important thing that the Prime Minister will need to address. And it's even more so for Mexico. I'm going to say something around 30-ish% of all of Mexican GDP is dependent on exports to the U.S.
So when you bring that up, how much are we exporting into Canada?
I don't have the number in front of me, but our two largest partners are Mexico and Canada, not China, Mexico and Canada.
Yeah, China's not
Um,
bringing a lot of stuff in from the United States.
no, no, not at all. And between the three countries, what we exchange a lot is cars and car parts.
Okay.
So we might get cars or car parts or partially assembled cars from Mexico, which is where most of it comes from. And then we would get stuff from Canada as well. And maybe Canada sends goods to Mexico, starters, seats, whatever you put into a car. And it goes back and forth. And, there's some study that says some components from cars will cross borders 4 or 5 times because you bring the starter into Mexico and it gets installed, and then the car gets taken over to a Canadian plant to finish assembly, and then back in the U.S. Goes back and forth. So cars and car parts are the biggest trade between all three countries. Now, as I say, 20 to 25% of all of Canadian GDP exports to the U.S. And the top import from Canada to us is oil. It's about 4 million barrels a day. And that is actually 20% of what we consume every day. So that's a pretty significant amount as well. If we're going to put a 25% tariff on that, that's going to impose a pretty big cost on consumers. And it's the biggest export uh, oil exports. Almost all of it from Canada goes into the U.S. So again, putting 25% tariffs on things both ways could be really damaging to both economies. Consumers get hit, jobs get hit, and so forth.
But it is a negotiation technique, you said.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's and it works because of all the things I just mentioned, the potential of really damaging any of those economies. And suddenly, Prime Minister Trudeau shows up at Mar-a-Lago and says, "Let's talk about this." And Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico says, "Let's talk about this." So it's a very effective negotiating technique. Um, in addition, I do want to say one further thing. Um, in, when you get tariffs imposed, the immediate reaction from politicians and economists like me saying, "Oh, well, that's just going to get passed on to consumers." Well, let's not go quite so fast, because I was at a supply chain conference this week, and some people who are much more involved than I am said, "Look, what happens when a big tariff gets on is if you have exporters and importer companies that have been working together for a long time, what they'll do is get together and say, listen, you take a third of the hit, I'll take a third of the hit, and we'll see what we can pass on to the consumer." So that's why tariffs haven't had so much damage in terms of inflation than you would have expected. The people involved along the chain try to absorb as much as possible. Nonetheless, it is definitely a very much of an incentive to negotiate on other points. There are a couple other things I should mention as well about the potential policy proposals. I think one of the campaign promises was to deport 8 million, I think was the number, undocumented aliens. And that's a very unrealistic number. We think it's going to be more like 1 million. It'd be very hard to do, and it would be damage to the economy. We've got 140 million people working here in the States, and you're going to get rid of 8 of them right away. Well, you're going to feel that. So I think that that's going to be a lot less than was proposed. So, and that would have been an inflationary effect because, those people work for much lower wages. So if they're gone, then wages are going to go up and inflation.
Now, I'm hearing and I'm being told that there are undocumented workers here that are getting paid by our government monthly on top of their work. So that money that they're being given will be what we save. Is that accurate? I'm asking you.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that, and that gets to be a kind of a sensitive, politically sensitive question. So I got to be a little bit careful about that because there are studies that show both things, depending on how the study's designed and who initiates them. In some, some are arguing, oh, okay, well, they may be getting government benefits, but they're also contributing to local economies and to national GDP and so forth. And a lot of them may, in fact, be paying into local taxes and so forth. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to leave it at that because, as I say, the studies can show both things at the moment. But this has been the inflationary concern: is slowing immigration and deporting people. Whatever you believe about whether that should be done in terms of protecting our borders or not, I think our borders should be protected more for fentanyl than anything else. But it's an inflationary effect because these low-income workers would be gone.
Well, I think
Now,
if any country is not a country if it doesn't have a border, correct? At some level.
yes, yes, and again, I don't want to get into a political discussion. Rather,
Yeah,
look at the policies, isolate the policy effect as much as possible.
absolutely.
Yeah. Um, and then last thing about the administration is the pro-growth policies of tax cuts and spending. Well, tax cuts and spending are supposed to be pro-growth, right? But they are inflationary because it puts more money into people's pockets.
Okay.
There is these proposals are supposed to be put together, are supposed to be implemented when a new budget is created. Well, the budget for the federal government runs out on September 30th of next year, and the new budget is supposed to go into October 1st. So, in theory, all of these proposals for the tax cuts and the spending aren't going to happen for almost a year, October 1st. However, then we get back into the political machinations of thing called reconciliation, which is a different way of getting parts of the budget through at different times of the year, and it can only be used a few times. And now we're getting into stuff I really don't talk about. But the point is to implement these fiscal programs that are stimulative but inflationary. It's not going to happen all at once, which is true of the tariffs as well. The big an operative word in the tariffs is ratchet up the tariffs. So you might impose, 10% on one country and they'll retaliate, and then you'll jack it up a little bit more. So they don't happen right away either.
Continue watching on the next episode of the Stay in Your Lane podcast.